In the year 146 BC, the Mediterranean world witnessed an act of destruction so complete, so methodical, that it would echo through history as one of the most brutal examples of imperial power unleashed without restraint. The great city of Carthage, once the jewel of North Africa and Rome's greatest rival, was systematically erased from existence, not conquered, not occupied, obliterated. This was not merely the end of a war, it was the annihilation of an entire civilization, carried out with a cold efficiency that shocked even the ancient world. What you are about to discover is the story of how a thriving metropolis of 500,000 souls became nothing more than ash and memory in the span of 7 days. The destruction of Carthage represents one of history's most decisive moments, when the balance of power in the Mediterranean shifted forever. For over a century, these two great powers had clashed in a series of conflicts that would determine the fate of the Western world. Rome and Carthage had fought before, but this time would be different. This time, there would be no negotiation, no mercy, no second chances. The Romans had made a decision that would haunt them for generations. Carthage must be destroyed. To understand the magnitude of what happened in 146 BC, we must first grasp what Carthage represented at the height of its power. Founded by Phoenician colonists 7 centuries earlier, Carthage had grown into a commercial empire that stretched across the Mediterranean. Its merchants traded in gold from Africa, silver from Spain, and luxury goods from the east. Its navy commanded the sea lanes, and its armies had once brought Rome itself to the brink of destruction under the brilliant general Hannibal. This was not some backwater settlement that Rome was preparing to crush. This was a civilization that had shaped the ancient world, but by 149 BC, that proud empire had been reduced to a shadow of its former glory. The Second Punic War, fought 50 years earlier, had ended in Carthaginian defeat and a treaty so harsh it transformed the once mighty empire into little more than a Roman client state. The terms were devastating. Carthage was stripped of all overseas territories. A crushing indemnity of 10,000 silver talents was to be paid over 50 years. Most importantly, Carthage was forbidden from waging war outside Africa, and even within Africa, only with Rome's explicit permission. The great naval power that had once ruled the Mediterranean was reduced to a coastal city dependent on Roman goodwill for its very survival. Yet even in this diminished state, Carthage remained prosperous. Its fertile lands produced abundant harvests. Its craftsmen created goods that were prized throughout the Mediterranean. Its population swelled to over 500,000 inhabitants, making it one of the largest cities in the ancient world. To many Romans, this prosperity was itself a threat. How could their former enemy be allowed to flourish while Rome struggled with internal divisions and the costs of empire? The spark that ignited the Third Punic War came from an unexpected source. Massinissa, the Numidian king and Rome's ally, had been systematically encroaching on Carthaginian territory for decades. Each time the Carthaginians complained to Rome, they were ignored or told to negotiate directly with their tormentor. Finally, in 150 BC, the Carthaginians had endured enough. They raised an army and marched against the Numidians, achieving a modest victory that would seal their doom. The moment news of Carthaginian military action reached Rome, the war party seized their opportunity. Here was the pretext they had been waiting for. Carthage had violated the treaty by waging war without Roman permission. The fact that they had been defending their own territory against decades of aggression was irrelevant. Marcus Porcius Cato the Elder, the most vocal advocate for Carthage's destruction, had been ending every speech in the Senate with the same chilling phrase regardless of the topic being discussed: Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. In 149 BC, Rome declared war for the third and final time. But this conflict would be unlike the previous Punic Wars. There would be no grand campaigns across multiple theaters, no brilliant strategic maneuvers or desperate gambles for survival. This would be a siege, pure and simple, designed to strangle the life out of Carthage, slowly and methodically. The Roman army that landed in North Africa was commanded by competent but unimaginative generals who believed that Carthaginian resistance would crumble at the first sign of serious Roman intent. They were wrong. When the Romans presented their terms, the true scope of their intentions became clear. The Carthaginians were told they could keep their freedom and their laws, but they must abandon their coastal city and relocate to a site at least 10 miles inland. For a civilization built on maritime trade, this demand was tantamount to a death sentence. The sea was not just Carthage's highway to prosperity, it was the lifeblood of their entire culture. The Carthaginian response was immediate and defiant. If they were going to die, they would die as Carthaginians, in their own city, fighting for everything their ancestors had built. The gates of Carthage slammed shut, and the greatest siege in ancient history began. What followed was a transformation that stunned the Roman besiegers. The Carthaginians turned their city into a massive fortress and arms factory. Every citizen became a soldier. Women cut their hair to make rope for catapults. Children carried supplies to the walls. The great commercial center that had once produced luxury goods now churned out weapons of war. Daily production reached staggering levels: 300 swords, 500 spears, 140 shields, and over 1,000 projectiles for siege engines. The workshops that had once created fine jewelry and elegant textiles now rang with the sound of hammers forging implements of death. The early Roman assaults were disasters. The first commanders sent to reduce Carthage proved hopelessly inadequate for the task. Their attacks were repelled with heavy losses, and Roman morale began to suffer. For 2 years, the siege dragged on with little progress. The Romans controlled the countryside, but the city itself seemed impregnable. Carthaginian defenders launched daring raids against Roman camps. Supply ships slipped through the blockade under cover of darkness. The proud legions that had conquered Macedonia and Syria found themselves stymied by a city that refused to surrender. Back in Rome, frustration mounted. How could the masters of the Mediterranean be held at bay by a single city? The answer came in 147 BC, when the Roman people made an extraordinary decision. They waived the usual age requirements and elected as consul a young man who carried one of the most famous names in Roman history. Publius Cornelius Scipio Aemilianus was the adopted grandson of Scipio Africanus, the hero who had defeated Hannibal at the Battle of Zama 55 years earlier. His biological father was Lucius Aemilius Paulus, the conqueror of Macedonia. This was a man bred for victory, carrying the genetic and cultural legacy of Rome's greatest military triumphs. Scipio Aemilianus arrived in North Africa with a clear understanding of what needed to be done. The previous commanders had tried to take Carthage by storm. He would starve it into submission. The young general immediately set about constructing massive engineering works designed to seal off every avenue of supply to the besieged city. A great mole was built across the harbor mouth to prevent ships from reaching the city. Walls and towers were erected to tighten the noose around Carthaginian necks. But the Carthaginians were not finished. Even as Scipio's siege works rose around them, they launched one final, desperate gamble. Working in secret, they dug a new channel from their inner harbor to the sea, bypassing the Roman mole entirely. When their newly constructed fleet sailed out to challenge the Roman blockade, it caught the besiegers completely off guard. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the old Carthaginian magic had returned. Their ships, hastily constructed from whatever materials could be found, burst from the harbor like phoenixes rising from ashes. The Roman fleet, caught unprepared and scattered, struggled to form battle lines as Carthaginian vessels sliced through their formations with the skill that had made their ancestors masters of the Mediterranean. But this was not the Carthage of Hamilcar or Hannibal. These were desperate men fighting with makeshift weapons aboard ships built from furniture and temple doors. The initial surprise gave way to grim reality as Roman discipline reasserted itself. The Carthaginian fleet, outnumbered and outgunned, was driven back to harbor after inflicting only minimal damage. Their bold gambit had failed, and with it died the last hope of breaking the siege from the sea. Scipio responded to this defiance with characteristic Roman thoroughness. He ordered the construction of a massive stone barrier across the harbor mouth, higher and stronger than his original mole. No ship would enter or leave Carthage again. The noose was complete, and now it would slowly tighten until the city strangled in its own desperation. Inside the walls, conditions deteriorated rapidly. Food became scarce, then precious, then non-existent. The wealthy ate their jewelry. The poor gnawed leather and boiled grass. Children grew thin and hollow-eyed, while their parents searched desperately for anything that might sustain life for another day. Disease spread through the crowded streets as sanitation collapsed, and bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. Yet still the Carthaginians fought. They had made their choice when they refused to abandon their city, and they would see it through to the bitter end. Hasdrubal, the general commanding the defense, declared that surrender was impossible. They had tortured Roman prisoners in full view of the besieging army, knowing it would make mercy unlikely. They had burned their bridges in the most literal sense, and now there was nothing left but to fight until the last man fell. The siege stretched through the winter of 147 into 146 BC. Roman engineers perfected their stranglehold, while Carthaginian defenders grew weaker by the day. Scipio waited with the patience of a spider, knowing that time was his greatest ally. Every passing week brought the defenders closer to collapse his, while own forces remained well supplied and disciplined. As spring arrived in 146 BC, Scipio finally judged the moment right for his assault. The Carthaginians were starving, exhausted, and desperate. Their ammunition was running low, their weapons dulled from constant use. Most importantly, their will to resist had been ground down by months of hopeless siege. The time had come to end this once and for all. The attack began at dawn from the harbor district, where Roman siege engines had finally battered down sections of the massive walls. Legionaries poured through the breaches in disciplined formations, their shields locked and their short swords ready. Behind them came engineers carrying tor, ready to burnishes and oil everything in their wake. What they found inside was unlike any city they had ever conquered. Every building had been fortified. Every street had become a killing ground. Every rooftop bristled with defenders armed with whatever weapons they could find. The Carthaginians had transformed their home into a maze of death traps, determined to make the Romans pay in blood for every step forward. The fighting that followed was brutal beyond description. Roman soldiers advanced methodically from house to house, breaking down doors and windows, climbing stairs slick with blood, battling defenders who knew they were fighting for their lives and the lives of their families. Women fought alongside men, hurling stones and boiling oil from upper windows. Children passed ammunition to adult fighters or fled screaming through smoke-filled streets. Scipio had given his orders clearly. No prisoners were to be taken for the first 6 days. Every Carthaginian encountered was to be killed without exception. The Romans methodically cleared each building, putting sword to everyone they found, then setting the structure ablaze behind them. The systematic nature of the slaughter was designed not just to eliminate resistance, but to send a message that would echo across the Mediterranean for generations. The narrow streets became channels of flame and smoke. 6-story apartment buildings collapsed in showers of sparks as their wooden frames succumbed to the fires. The screams of the dying mixed with the crackle of flames and the crash of falling masonry. Ancient Carthage, 7 centuries in the making, was disappearing street by street, building by building, life by life. For 6 days, this methodical destruction continued. Roman soldiers worked in shifts, relieved when exhaustion threatened their efficiency. Fresh troops stepped over the bodies of their predecessors' victims to continue the grim work of extermination. The discipline that had made Rome master of the world was now applied to the complete elimination of its greatest rival. On the 7th day, something changed. Perhaps it was exhaustion, perhaps it was the realization that the work was nearly done, or perhaps even Roman stomachs had limits to the slaughter they could witness. Scipio gave new orders. Prisoners could now be taken. The killing could become selective rather than universal. By this point, however, there were precious few Carthaginians left to spare. The systematic slaughter of the previous 6 days had reduced the city's population from over 500,000 to perhaps 50,000 souls cowering in the ruins of their civilization. These survivors, hollow-eyed and broken, were herded into the great square like cattle, their fate already decided by Roman efficiency and ruthlessness. The final act of this tragedy played out at the Temple of Eshmaun, high on the Byrsa hill that dominated the city. Here, in the most sacred precinct of Carthaginian religion, the last desperate defenders had made 100 men their stand. 9 Roman, mostly deserters who knew they could expect no mercy, had barricaded themselves inside the temple walls, determined to sell their lives as dearly as possible. Hasdrubal, the Carthaginian general who had led the defense with such determination, now faced the ultimate test of his resolve. The man who had sworn to fight to the death, who had tortured Roman prisoners in full view of their comrades, who had proclaimed that surrender was impossible, suddenly found his courage failing him. As the flames engulfed the temple and the screams of the dying echoed from within, Hasdrubal slipped away from his men and approached the Roman lines with his hands raised in submission. Scipio Aemilianus watched with cold contempt as the Carthaginian commander prostrated himself in the dust, begging for mercy that would never come. This was the man who had defied Rome for 3 years, who had transformed a commercial city into a fortress of resistance. Now he groveled before his enemies while his own soldiers burned alive in the temple behind him. But if Hasdrubal thought his surrender would bring him safety, he had not reckoned with his own wife. From the temple walls, her voice cut through the smoke and flames like a blade. She had watched her husband's betrayal with growing fury, and now she would have her final say. Clutching her 2 young children to her breast, she stepped to the edge of the burning temple and hurled curses down upon the man she had once loved. Her words rang across the ruins with a power that made even hardened Roman soldiers pause in their work of destruction. She called him coward and traitor, accused him of valuing his own miserable life above the honor of their people and the memory of their ancestors. How could he kneel before the destroyers of everything they held sacred? How could he beg for mercy from men who had shown none to their children, their elders, their entire civilization? Then, as Hasdrubal watched in horror, and the Romans looked on in stunned silence, she raised the children high above her head. These innocents, she declared, would not live to see their father's shame or to serve as slaves in Roman households. They would die as free Carthaginians, as their ancestors had lived. With that, she hurled both children into the flames below and leaped after them, her final scream lost in the roar of the conflagration. The Roman deserters who remained in the temple followed her example, choosing death over capture. One by one, they threw themselves into the fire, their bodies adding fuel to the blaze that consumed the last remnant of Carthaginian resistance. The temple of Eshmaun, sacred heart of their faith, became their funeral pyre. Scipio Aemilianus stood watching this final scene with tears streaming down his face. The young general who had prosecuted the siege with such methodical efficiency now found himself overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he had accomplished. As the flames reached toward the sky and the screams faded to silence, he began to recite lines from Homer's Iliad, verses that spoke of Troy's destruction and the fall of great cities. A day shall come when sacred Troy shall perish, and Priam and his people shall be slain. The words Semitic now, as if the ancient poet had foreseen this moment when another great city would join Troy in the realm of memory and legend. Polybius, the Greek historian who witnessed these events, later recorded that Scipio wept not just for his enemies but for the recognition that all earthly power was transient. Rome itself, he realized, might one day face the same fate as the city burning before him. The destruction of Carthage was now complete, but the work of obliteration had only just begun. Scipio ordered his engineers to systematically demolish every structure that remained standing. Walls were pulled down stone by stone. Foundations were dug up and scattered. Gardens were uprooted and salted, so that nothing would grow there again. The Romans were determined that no trace of Carthaginian civilization would survive to inspire future rebellions or serve as a rallying point for Rome's enemies. The thoroughness of this destruction was unprecedented in the ancient world. Previous conquerors had been content to loot cities and enslave populations, but they typically left the physical infrastructure intact for their own use. Rome chose a different path entirely. They wanted Carthage not merely defeated but erased, as if it had never existed at all. This was cultural genocide on a scale that shocked even contemporary observers who were accustomed to the brutalities of ancient warfare. Teams of Roman soldiers worked for weeks to complete this systematic erasure. Public buildings were reduced to rubble. Private homes were torn apart beam by beam. Even the sewers and water systems were deliberately destroyed to ensure that the site could not quickly be resettled. The harbor that had once welcomed ships from across the Mediterranean was filled with debris and blocked with massive stone barriers. The surviving population faced a fate that many would have considered worse than death. 50,000 Carthaginians, the remnant of a once proud people, were loaded onto ships bound for slave markets across the Roman world. Families were separated without regard for their bonds of affection. Children were torn from their mothers' arms. Elderly grandparents were chained alongside their grandchildren, all reduced to the same status as livestock in Roman eyes. These survivors carried with them the memories of their lost civilization, but they would have no opportunity to pass those memories on to future generations. Scattered across the empire and forced to work in Roman mines, farms, and households, they would gradually lose their language, their customs, and their identity. Within a generation, the living culture of Carthage would be as dead as the city itself. The Roman Senate, not content with the physical destruction already accomplished, took additional steps to ensure that Carthage could never rise again. They formally prohibited any settlement on the site, declaring the entire area cursed and forbidden to human habitation. Religious ceremonies were performed to consecrate this prohibition, invoking the gods as witnesses to Rome's determination that Carthage should remain forever desolate. The conquered territories of the Carthaginian Empire were organized into the new Roman province of Africa, with the loyal city of Utica serving as its capital. Roman colonists would eventually settle the fertile lands that had once fed Carthage, but the great city itself was left as a monument to Roman power and Roman ruthlessness. Wild animals would roam through streets where merchants had once haggled over prices and children had played in the shadows of their parents' shops. News of Carthage's destruction spread across the Mediterranean world with the speed that only truly shocking events can achieve. In the courts of kings and the assemblies of city-states, men struggled to comprehend the magnitude of what Rome had accomplished. They had not merely defeated a rival or conquered a territory. They had eliminated an entire civilization, wiping it from the earth as completely as if it had been struck by divine lightning. The psychological impact of this achievement was perhaps even more significant than its immediate military consequences. Every potential enemy of Rome now understood that resistance could lead not just to defeat, but to complete annihilation. The Romans had demonstrated that they possessed both the power and the will to erase entire peoples from existence. This knowledge would influence diplomatic calculations and military decisions for generations to come. Yet the destruction of Carthage also marked a turning point in Roman character. The Republic itself, that had begun as a small city-state, defending itself against its neighbors, had become an empire capable of genocide. The values that had made Rome great, courage and discipline and devotion to the common good, had been transformed into instruments of unprecedented destruction. Some Romans celebrated this transformation as evidence of their divine destiny to rule the world. Others wondered what they had become in their pursuit of absolute security. The same year that witnessed Carthage's fall also saw the destruction of Corinth, the last free city of Greece. Two great centers of ancient civilization vanished in 146 BC, marking the moment when Rome's dominance over the Mediterranean became complete and unchallengeable. The age of independent city-states and rival empires had ended. The age of Roman hegemony had begun. The victory at Carthage transformed Rome from a regional power into the undisputed master of the Mediterranean, but the cost of this triumph would resonate through Roman society for generations. The legions that returned from North Africa brought with them not just the spoils of war, but also the psychological burden of what they had witnessed and participated in. These were soldiers who had systematically burned families alive in their homes, who had methodically slaughtered children and elderly citizens, who had reduced one of the world's great cities to ash and memory. The efficiency with which they had carried out this work of destruction spoke to Roman discipline, also revealed but it's something darker about the empire they were building. The economic windfall from Carthage's destruction was immediate and substantial. Vast quantities of gold, silver, and precious goods flowed into Roman treasuries. The fertile agricultural lands of North Africa, no longer serving Carthaginian interests, became Roman estates worked by Roman colonists and Carthaginian slaves. Trade routes that had enriched Carthage for centuries now enriched Rome instead. The elimination of their greatest commercial rival opened opportunities new markets, and that Roman merchants were quick to exploit. But perhaps the most significant consequence was the message that Carthage's destruction sent to every other power in the Mediterranean world. Kings and generals from Spain to Syria, now understood that Rome's definition of victory had fundamentally changed. Previous conflicts had ended with treaties, tributes, and territorial adjustments. Now they knew that resistance to Roman will could result in complete obliteration. This knowledge would shape every future diplomatic negotiation and military campaign, as potentialized the risks enemies we of defiance against the certainty of Roman retribution. The eagles of Rome soared triumphant over the ashes of Carthage, but their victory came at a price that would echo through the centuries. In 7 days of systematic destruction, Rome had not merely defeated an enemy, but transformed itself into something unprecedented in the ancient world, an empire willing to erase entire civilizations to secure its dominance. The ghost of Carthage would haunt Roman dreams, a reminder that absolute power demands absolute choices, and that some victories cost more than defeats ever could.